Good morning. One of the things that we learn about God in the scriptures is that he's in no hurry. There's no rush. There's a lot to do, but there's plenty of time to do it in. Now, I said we'd look at covenants today. Now, this is not difficult. A covenant is a promise made by God to us. And if we had it today, we would call it a contract. And the first covenant that we have in Scripture is in Genesis 3, verse 15, where God is promising the whole of humanity that a seed is going to come and will destroy the devil. And it gives us hope. Now, it's another 2,000 years before God clarifies any of this promise. In between times, we have the flood. And after the flood, God reminded Noah that the whole of humanity is under the condemnation of death. He explained in Genesis chapter 9 that our blood represents our life. And in verse 5 he says this: I will demand an account of your lifeblood. Our lives are owed to God. He gave us life. He has the right to take it away, unless he can do something so that we can keep our lives and keep living. So, 2,000 years after the Garden of Eden and the promise made there, we come to Abraham, chapter 12 of Genesis, where God says to Abraham, I will bless those who bless you. All the tribes of the earth shall bless themselves by means of you. God made this promise because of Abraham's great faith. And then he says to Abraham, after asking him to move to the land of Canaan, he said, it is to your descendants that I will give this land. God makes many promises or covenants to Abraham in the next few chapters, that Abraham's descendants would be many. And it seems that God is going to use a whole nation in the outworking of salvation. Why, we don't know at this point, but that comes later. Now, one of the special promises that God made to Abraham is in Genesis chapter 17, where he said to Abraham that Sarah would have a son. Now, she was well past childbearing age, but she was to have a son, and he was to be named Isaac. Now, the special promise made about this is in verse 19, where God says with him, that's with Isaac, I will establish my covenant, a covenant in perpetuity, to be his God and the God of his descendants. And then he says, my covenant I will establish with Isaac. So Isaac was to have children, and God's promises to Isaac later on would that once again he would have many descendants, and they would be the means of blessing everyone else on the planet. Now, how strong would Abraham's faith be in this promise that Isaac was to have many descendants? Before Isaac had children, God asked Abraham to take Isaac to the land of Moriah and sacrifice him. Now, why, you think, to us that seems unbelievable. It couldn't happen. So why did God do this? Why did he ask Abraham to do this? Well, first of all, it was a test of Abraham's faith in God's promises. And we can use it maybe to see, do we have the same sort of faith that God's promises are absolutely certain? The other thing, there was no way that God was going to allow Abraham to kill Isaac, but Abraham didn't know that at the time. But it helps us to understand all the emotional trials and trauma that a person would have to go through to sacrifice their child. But this is what God was going to have to go through. In John 3 verse 16, God loved the world so much that he was willing to offer his son. Now, Jesus, of course, was willing to do this. He loved mankind as well. But you see, we don't only learn head knowledge. We don't just learn the nuts and bolts of salvation. We learn the emotional, the devastation that's gone into providing salvation for mankind. Very, very difficult to cope with. Now, the other thing about Abraham offering up Isaac was that it was to be in the mountain of Moriah. Now, this was where Solomon built the temple. And it's quite likely that Isaac was offered up, almost, on the very same place, or very near it, to where Jesus, 2,000 years later, was to lose his life. So God is trying to help us understand what was going to have to happen, or the emotional distress involved in our salvation, and how it was going to be worked out. So I'll leave that with you this morning. Thank you so much for watching, and God bless you all.